Through exchange, the individual fundamentally extends himself beyond his solipsistic circle, much more so than by robbing or giving presents. Exchange in its basic features is possible, however, only with private property. All collective property tends towards mortmain, whereas the specific wishes of the individual and his need of supplementation make exchange necessary for him. Possessions must first be concentrated in the individual for them to spread out from there through the process of exchange. Money as the absolute representative and embodiment of exchange becomes, by means of private property, with its dependence upon exchange, the vehicle for the expansion of the economy, for the inclusion of innumerable contracting parties through the give-and-take of the exchange process. In so doing, however, money resists, and this is the reverse side of the same fact, certain collectivist arrangements that are quite natural in a barter economy. During the Middle Ages, the theory prevailed that money payment could be demanded only from those who had personally promised it, therefore the members of the estates that had not been present in the voting assembly often refused to pay. In early 13th century England, it was not yet officially decreed that the decision of the Supreme Council of Estates should be binding with respect to taxation for all subjects and against the will of individuals. When, towards the end of the Middle Ages, the provincial estates in Germany formed a corporation that acted as a single unit, often in opposition to the feudal lord, and when its decisions were not the sum total of individual decisions but a decision of all the estates, the former interpretation remained valid for a long time with regard to the granting of taxes. The totality of estates was for a long time considered to be only the sum total of individuals, so that any individual could withdraw himself from the common decision. The same motive becomes effective under very changed circumstances where, with the growing centralization of state administration, local associations nonetheless remain relatively free concerning their financial policy. German legislation in recent decades, for example, has tended to restrict the social, political and moral obligations of local communities and to reduce them to local organs of the government, while, in contrast, the communities have been given considerable autonomy regarding financial administration. Similar considerations prevail if one emphasizes as the main disadvantage of money finds that money is economically less useful in the hands of the state than in those of the individual. Therefore, it is more expedient to grant a certain degree of freedom with reference to the handling of money to whomever is limited in all other respects, a somewhat disguised practical consequence and form of the difficulties with which collectivistic disposal of money has to cope. Such a difficulty exists despite money's suitability for representing the common interest for the unification of otherwise incompatible individuals. Both aspects may ultimately be traced back to one and the same effect of money, namely to grant separation and mutual independence to those elements that originally existed as a living unity. On the one hand, this disintegration concerns individual personalities and thereby makes possible the convergence of similar interests, however divergent and irreconcilable, in a collective form. On the other hand, this disintegration also affects the communities and makes internal and external communalization difficult for the now sharply differentiated individuals. The form that this contradiction takes permeates the whole of social life far beyond this particular case. It has its origin in the fact that the individual is only one element and member of the social unity, while at the same time being himself a whole entity, whose elements form a relatively closed unity. The role of the individual as a mere organ will frequently clash with the role that he can or wants to play as a separate organism. The same influence that affects both the social entity composed of individuals and the individual as a whole entity, produces the same formal effects in both cases. This often results in actual opposition, since the individual represents these two completely heterogeneous consequences. Therefore, it may be a practical though not insoluble logical contradiction that money brings about the differentiation of elements in society just as much as in the individual. In society's case, money impedes, in the individual's case it facilitates the same phenomenon. The impediment of the collectivistic disposal of money is, in general, connected with this. All other possessions refer to a certain type of usage by virtue of their technical condition. The freedom of disposition over them therefore has an objective limit. Money's usage completely lacks such a limitation, and its common arrangement by many people therefore provides the broadest scope for opposing tendencies. Thus, the money economy stands in decisive contrast to the living conditions of small economic groups who are frequently dependent upon common orders and uniform regulations. One might say, though greatly simplifying the case, that the small group supports itself through individualization and the division of labor. Money as an abstract form evolves out of the economic interactions within a relatively large circle and at the same time, through its merely quantitative character, permits the most exact mechanical expression of every specific demand, of the value of every individual work activity, of every personal tendency. In so doing, money first completes in the economic sphere the general sociological correlation between the expansion of the group and the development of individuality. The relationship of money to private property and thereby to the free development of the personality is largely conditioned by its movability, and this becomes particularly obvious in its opposite, the ownership of land. Landed property extends beyond the connection with the individual in two directions, breadthwise because, more than anything else, it is suited to the collective property of a group, and depthwise because it is the best object for inheritance. If the whole property of a primitive group consisted of landed property, then development would take place in two main directions. First, by producing food from property it gains a more mobile character. As soon as this happens, private property emerges. As a rule, nomadic peoples hold land as common property of the tribe and assign it only for the use of individual families, but livestock is always the private property of these families. As far as we know, the nomadic tribe has never been communistic with regard to cattle as property. In many other societies two movables were already private property while land remained common property for a long period thereafter. On the other hand, the origin of private property is connected with those activities that are independent of land as a factor of production. In the law of the Indian extended family, the notion developed that whatever had been acquired independently of the family fortune, which consisted predominantly of land, did not have to be incorporated into it. The acquisition of an individual skill, for example learning a craft, is mentioned as the main method for acquiring property and personal independence. The craftsman who carries his skill with him has thereby acquired a mobile commodity which, just like the ownership of cattle, though in a different fashion, severs the individual from landed property and from its collectivistic character. Finally, the transition from a communal to an individual form of life is a useful means for preserving the cooperation that resulted from it after the barter economy dissolved. Until the 13th century, the assets of the religious communities consisted largely of landed property and their management was based on the principle of the social economy. The decline in farming profits led to a serious economic crisis, but the emergent money economy that had brought about this crisis also provided a remedy. The revenues of the benefactors and even of the monasteries were more or less extensively split up into salaries and benefactions, and now more of them, from various distant areas, could be given to a single person because the revenue was calculated in money terms. In this way it was still possible, with sinking total revenues, to maintain the income of at least the leading and representative persons of the communities at the same level, although this occurred at the expense of the lower clergy who now had to serve the community as hirelings. This chain of events clearly shows how the declining importance of land pushes even those groups, such as the Church, that are specifically intended for cooperation and unity from collectivistic to individualistic forms of life, and how the intruding money economy forms the cause just as much as the means for this process, by the subdivision and mobilization of land. The reason why the peasant today is the most unyielding adversary of socialistic tendencies lies firstly in the fact that, in practical contrast with the techniques of his trade, he is extremely conservative. Since private property now exists he clings to it, just as he did centuries ago to the German mark community and much later still to mixed crop farming. Modern socialism has one main feature which is totally antipathetic to the earlier collectivism of landed property and quite alien to the farmer's impulses in life, namely the complete control of production by reason, the will and the organizing calculations of man. The organization of the factory and the construction of machinery demonstrates daily to the industrial worker that efficient movements and effects can be accomplished with absolute accuracy.